look further.
And
I
welcome
really want to read
Theology and Ice Cream.
more stories
If you're
of
wondering
this type,
why
as well as write them.
there's a
And
video
so I
of
encourage people
someone
to look
streaming on the
on
other
their own
screen
and
rather
to,
than
to find the
just me
answers to some of these
directly, and he's
questions. And
talking
like I
over
said,
me.
by providing sources and
I'm
providing locations
actually
where they can be found,
attending
hopefully it can
at this
encourage
point
people to do so.
a
We
very
have the
interesting
advantage of living in an age where
online
even
lecture
in the
about
situation we're in, you can
Black
find a lot of
history
stuff
in the
online,
city of Sacramento from the
including a
time
lot
of
of
the Civil
library
War
materials, a lot
to
of research
I think the
materials, a
early
lot of recordings,
1900s and
interviews, a lot
so
of the
on.
narratives and things
So
like this are
that
things
is
that you can
going from
find via
7
archive.org,
to
another important source, and
6 to 8,
finds
and so I
firsthand
was there
accounts,
for the first
direct
hour, and it
reports,
is
and
being recorded.
interviews,
If you want
as
to
well as the
see the
official record,
recording, it's
which,
on the West End
while far
Club
from perfect, is
on
what we have.
Facebook. It's also being recorded elsewhere, so I will be coming back and looking at this. He's a local historian who has written books on local Sacramento history and has a lot of images right now.
Yes,
We're just
CDNC. Thank you. Eric
so it's a
mentioned
good
CDNC,
transition.
which is a website which has the
Whew!
Pacific
Here
Appeal,
we
as
are,
well as
back
the Sacramento
again.
Union, and a lot of California
Let's close
papers.
that
The
screen.
Sacramento Public Library's website has the Sacramento.
I was actually looking forward to spending some time there, but there you go. I'll spend my time here in this lovely wintry scene. On hot days, I think it's always nice to have lovely wintry scenes to help us feel a little more comfortable. Okay. I was gone last week. I was up in Oregon, actually. We had a very nice time up there. It was beautifully sunny for everything except for the last few days, which is very rare. I think Oregon always tries to grab me and pull me in. And whenever we try to go up there for the first 5 days, we stayed at a house that Amy's sister, his family has, that was part of something her husband's grandfather had passed down the land on the Santiam River, and they built a house there, and so we stayed in this nice place with Amy's other sister and family, and a lot of space right on the river. It was gorgeous. It was wonderful. Let's see, do I have a video of this? I might, in fact, have a video of this. I know everyone's thinking right now, but do you have a video of this? Let's see if I do have a video. How many times can I say video? Do I have a video, 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 video? Let's see. Try this one on for size. Try this one. Oh, I need a codec. What I did was my phone plays some heavy duty. Oh. Try this one. Do you have one of the whole river? Oh, not now. No, not now.
Oh,
Close.
sorry. I turned them into frogs. Oh, that's okay.
Let's try this. Oh man, all my videos aren't working. Let's see, that was Oliver. Let's see, try this one. Who does a vertical video? I was trying to experiment with my little bird in a tree, but it's green so you can't see it. A very unusual thing going on there. And you're wondering, what is he doing? Where's the theology? We're here for the theology, not for the rest of this. Let's see. Try this one. Man, it just doesn't like me. I need to figure out how to play these videos a little bit better. What it is I think my computer... Oh. doesn't like to play the 4K stuff. And that is enough of that.
Oh, sorry. I turned.
Good timing there, Oliver. I don't have some river. Come on, look at it. I get no videos of the actual river itself. No. No. Ultra slow motion videos. That's something fun. Oh, there we go. How about that? It's pretty nice. So that's the actual view there as we're sitting by the river. This is so ice. There are some chairs. This is the Santiam River. Very nice and gorgeous and whatnot. All right. But that's not why we're here, right? Why are we here? What are we doing here? What is life about? How can we gaze upon the heavens and see what we are dealing with? Oh, look at that. Is that, what scene is that? It's a mystical land from which we can experience new insights and joys. So there we go. We are back in Skyrim, enjoying the night sky, experiencing the beauty and the peace. Listen, it's all quiet. But that's not what we're talking about. What are we doing here? Well, what we're doing here is continuing a discussion that was started last fall. Some friends of mine at my church said, Patrick, you teach theology. Why don't you do something online? Why don't you stream some discussions on theology? Because there's just a lot of people who think they know a little bit about Christianity, and a lot of them are Christians, and they there's just not a lot of teaching. There's a lot of like speaking at. What my goal is to share what Christianity is. Believe it, don't believe it, but know what you're dealing with. That's my goal. Like, one reason we're streaming is just to get kind of a wider variety of people around, people from all sorts of different backgrounds who are in this and committed to this and just want some new insights. I mean, that's one reason why I studied theology, was because I was feeling pretty lost and frustrated with my experiences, and I said, if these experiences is everything there is to this, I'm out. And so I started reading, and I started studying early church history, and that blossomed. And the funny thing is, when you're 20, you think you know everything there is to know, and you think you've learned it all, and so you can move on. But the more you actually dig into any subject, you answer some questions, but you also awaken a lot more questions. And as I've studied and poured myself and now professionally do this, teach theology and church history and other church things at Fuller Seminary, I just keep having more and more answers, but also more and more questions. And that's another reason why I really like discussing this in places that aren't in these narrow conversations, because when you're in the narrow conversation of people who do this in the guild, they are talking about at levels that are interesting, but it's often removed, and often it's too narrow in scope, because the conversations they have are the conversations they're hearing, and you get sort of in this circle kind of discussion that is slowly walled off from the rest of the world. And our experiences with God, our experiences with life, our experiences with society are really not walled off. If anything, the questions of theology have to have some kind of connection with what we're actually wrestling with in order to be true to itself. And if they don't have the kinds of answers or are leading us down a certain kind of direction, then let's look somewhere else. And even I think the early Christians understood this. They weren't committed to something just because, this was going to give them fame and fortune. I love what Paul the Apostle Paul writes in the first letter of the Corinthians, chapter 15. He says, if the resurrection didn't happen, we're all wasting our time. We'd be pitied. And that's what it comes down to, is like, if this stuff isn't true, if this stuff doesn't help, if this stuff doesn't relate, move on. Do something different. But if the stuff I'm talking about today and the stuff I've especially talked about in previous weeks actually fits better, not only an explanation of God, but an explanation of reality. Excuse me, little allergies. No, I do not have the coronavirus. But the benefit, of course, of this setting is we are all socially distanced. So, no masks required. If you are sitting in front of your computer screen, if you're in public, by all means, do what makes you feel most comfortable and those around you most comfortable. So what we're talking about, and we're continuing because I thought it was something interesting to me, and each week I'm going through the Apostles' Creed and spending more, 3 to 4 weeks on each of the statements and seeing what it comes out of it. Sometimes I spend a little longer, sometimes a little less, but what I'm trying to do is just walk through what is it we say we believe. What, not just believe, not just things we experience in Christianity, but really what are the things that are true about Christianity that may be good critiques of how it's often practiced, and reminders to us, orientation to us. What is a way we can better understand what is it we're trying to do? And maybe that helps us understand some frustrations we have. Like maybe it helps us answer some questions. Maybe it gives us a new kind of vision or excitement about what it is we're doing. Or maybe you just are an outsider and you're like, what do these people believe? The only thing I know about them is what's on the news. Never trust the news. Can I say that out loud? The news often is doing things that are for their own benefit or just out of their own ignorance. I lived in a place where they had some, and this isn't just about Christianity. I'm not just saying, don't trust them that we're oppressed. It's just people who are trying to teach on something they don't know about are going to frame it in a way that makes it apparent they don't know about it, whether that's a current event, whether that's a philosophy, whether that's whatever. And so if oftentimes the presentation is distorted because the people who don't understand it, or because they're highlighting something that gets in the news because of a distortion. My goal here is to say, love it, like it, don't like it, but know it. Know what we're dealing with. And so the last few weeks we've been talking about the church. I started by talking about what is it that the church is, how can we understand it, what makes a church the church, and there's some formal ways of talking about that's usually packaged in the title of ecclesiology. You can talk about who the leadership structure, you can talk about the communion elements, you can talk about the worship, you can talk about sort of the formal experiences of this discussion that makes people have very strong opinions and have very strong disagreements with people who believe 90% of the same things on the big topics but can't agree with other things, which is odd because it's the stuff in the Apostles' Creed here that was intended to say this is a unifying expression of what Christianity is. If you agree with this, we're all on the same team. If you disagree with this, you're on a different team. And yet, in the history of the church, people who agree with these statements that we're going through disagree on some other matters and then won't hang out together. And that's wrong. As I've talked about this more, I'm also trying to... Ooh, great question. Sorry, I just got to that. News. Are the stories the same as the Holy Bible? So if we shouldn't believe in the news, should we not believe in the Bible? Wow, that is a really good question. No, I would say that if you are coming to the Bible with an experience of faith, there's an amount of trust. Is this trustworthy? And so put it to the test. We're going by witnesses. So maybe a distinction between the news and the Bible might be better as a way to say the news is able to do things for different reasons than what would be allowed in, say, a courtroom. So a courtroom has a stricter version of testimony. You say an oath. You are committed to this, whereas the news might be very faithful, but you don't trust it. As I was going to say, that this is it's. I lived in the mountains, and there were some major wildfires back then, and the frustrating thing was those of us who were in the area were seeing what was going on live, and then we were getting calls and messages from friends who were saying that the whole place had burned down. Well, who are you going to trust? Are you going to trust the news, or are you going to trust the eyewitnesses? And that's really what I'm trying to come to terms with. Is when we talk about my frustration with the news isn't that these are evil or horrible. It's because if you're getting things second or third hand, or you have some other goal in expressing it. Whereas the Bible is people saying this is our experiences with God, and God is the God of all of us. So what we say in the Bible is true isn't necessarily saying that I have my own private faith, or that I have my own, and we can all have these, and people out there aren't part of what God is doing. Really what I'm saying is there's an expression and understanding of who God is, and we don't get to say who God is. We don't get to determine who God is. That's not up to me. But I would argue as a Christian, I would say that the Bible is a trustworthy expression of the revelation of God. Now, if you read the Bible, you realize God certainly does interact with a broad group of people. God does say he is the God of all. God so loves the world, not a certain group of people, that he sent his son. God is a creator of all things. And so this is a way of saying that God is both all encompassing, but God is also understood differently. Does that mean everyone is equal in their understanding? Well, no. And that's where it comes down to, this idea that it's not so much saying that religion is separation, or that we're trying to create divisions and teams or anything. It's basically saying, is Jesus Christ a trustworthy representative of who God is? And if that's true, then what Jesus says is a trustworthy testimony of who we should be. Now, that has a lot of overlap with a lot of different things going on in the world. But Islam argues something differently about who Jesus is. Buddhism argues something differently about what reality is like. And these aren't necessarily like believe what you want. These are different pictures of reality that are saying something fundamentally different about ultimate truth, but also what does it mean to be fully human? And so where we have disagreements, we have disagreements. And I could be wrong. And this is where I'm saying, like, I'm humble enough to say, I could be wrong on this. Other people could be right. I don't think that's true. And that is just the argument that my argument here is that Christianity, in what it's saying about reality and God, is the way, the truth, and the life. People can disagree with that. That's fine. I'm not the judge. So, can you enter the kingdom of God if you're not a Christian? I'm not the judge. I'm a witness. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm witnessing to the testimony of what Scripture has told me, what the disciples passed on, my own experiences, my own study. I'm a witness, like in a courtroom, right? There's a lot of different witnesses. Now, someone who's on the jury isn't going to take everyone's story and say, well, every witness is true if they're saying something different. They have to, you weigh, you value, you say, well, this person is maybe not saying the right thing. And what my argument is that Christianity is saying, what does it mean to be fully human? What does it mean to trust in God? Does that mean that, these are great questions coming at me on Facebook. No people are the same, so God to me, but it's not about what God means to me. See, that's the thing. It's what God is, God's self. If we start subjectively, if we start by saying, my God is what determines reality, and thus everyone needs to agree with me, well, that's getting into some tricky place. But I'm not the God of God. See, what Christianity starts with is saying God is true, and there are truths to how God has revealed himself. And it's not up to me for me to say God is like this. It's for me to say God has revealed this to certain people. Do I trust them? And then, as much as I trust them, I'm going to share their testimony. I'm going to share their witnesses. At what point does someone's experience or expression of life get outside the work of salvation of God? Well, that's up to God, right? This is up to Jesus. In the Gospels, Jesus interacted with a lot of people. And my comment always is that there's going to be a lot of people in heaven we don't expect. But there's also going to be people we expect in heaven who may not be there. It's not up to me, but it is up to me to say this is what we're trying to do. And the challenge for me in all these conversations is so much of the conversation about who gets saved or all the rest becomes competitive or becomes a power struggle, or I'm the good people and you're the bad people, or some kind of alienating expression of like dominance or whatever, and it's a triumphalism. Whereas my approach, and this comes out of what really my goal is not to say I believe this I'm better than you. It's to say I think this is a good way. I think this is a way of hope for people. And if I love people, which I should do more than I really do, I'm working on that, then I say, here's the way. Here's hope. Are you really struggling? Here's a way. And I also say, here's the ways the church has really missed its message and caused alienation and distortion. And if it does that, then the very testimony I'm talking about isn't one of triumphalism. It's a way of saying, if you're representing Jesus, you have to get it right. You can't use the methods and patterns of and dominance and power of all the rest to get people in your club or to make people feel horrible. That's not what Jesus did. He offered an invitation to people into the fullness of life. Now, like with Jesus, people can hear that and say, I disagree with you. That's fine. You know what? I'm not the judge. Take this what you will. But for people who are struggling, for people who are hurting, for people who have been broken by life on their own or life in the church, my hope is to say that there's a better way. And that's the way that I've been walking. And as I've been walking it, I experience there's this fullness of hope. It's like a diet, I guess, right? Maybe one example would be there's different ways you can exercise, but things that are can be bad for you, or things that could be more helpful for you. It's not a great analogy, but it's if someone's eating a lot of Cheetos all day and all night and they're feeling sick, I'm going to say, you know what, you probably shouldn't be eating those things. Well, what should I eat? Well, this is where here's a better way to eat. Well, what's the best way to eat? People can have different diets, right? So this is where the analogy breaks down a little bit. I'm not really doing good on my analogies today. So really what we're talking about here is, what does it mean to live as a community who are witnessing to the revelation of God as expressed through the life of Jesus in the power of the Holy Spirit, so that we say we're not disconnected from God as some remote historical figure, but that we're very present with what God is doing. And that presence with God should be transforming us to be the kind of people who resonate God's hope and life to others. We shouldn't be caught in traps or cages or all the rest where we can, like, where's the way out? Is it this door? Is it that door? And what I'm talking about here in terms of the church, thank you. What I'm talking about in terms of the church should be a place where people experience freedom. Not judgment, though there is a certain amount of judgment, because if our goal is to find fullness, there's certain things we shouldn't be doing. But if that's the point of it, guilt, then you're missing the point. Where's the way of life? And that's why I have, if we think of the church not as this gathering of people who are holier than thou and separate and vote this way or that, but we say, what if people understood, what if we understood the church as being defined as a way of life and hope, a community of people that are seeking together the way of life and a way of hope. People might disagree with that way, but I think there would be a completely different understanding of how we're trying to navigate life together, life in society. And that's where my frustration comes. Both my hope for the church, but also my frustration is that if we make it only about getting to heaven and you got to punch your ticket, then that makes, ins or outs, and we always categorize. But if we say we're all traveling together in light of the Holy Spirit, so that every day we become more and more of who God has created us to be, and more a reflection of the kind of community that he wants for humanity, that's beautiful. But it's also difficult because we all have stuff that we don't want to give up. We all have junk we don't want to let go. We all have our friends and we all have our enemies. We want to find, what does it mean to be free? But sometimes that means letting things go that we don't want to let go. Because sometimes religion puts us in a box, but sometimes we also put ourselves in a box. And we need others around us. And we need some kind of outside wisdom from God to say, well, here's the better way. I know you like doing that, but it's not good for you. I know you love eating chocolate cake, but don't do it 4 times a day, right? So as we go through this, the way of life and hope, I'm coming with, I think, 8 different ways of defining, thinking about the church in some kind of different way. And these aren't typical kinds of doctrines, but these are maybe a framework to say, what if, rather than start off by saying what a church is, it's a place that meets Sunday mornings and you wear this and you sing this song and you have 4 songs and then you have a 45-minute lecture and then you have, and we all sit in rows and all the things that so many people think of when they think of church. What if we were to say that, well, actually, church can take a lot of different shapes. It's not about the specific task. It's about an orientation in the life of God. And what does that mean in our context? What does that mean with our history? What does that mean for our setting, which can be different for me or you in a different place, in a different world? We all have these ways and contexts that we're trying to fight against the powers of death and the strongholds that take hold of us. The United States has a kind of history that has Christianity mingled through a lot of sin. Well, what does it mean to be the church in light of this history that has a lot of yay, freedom, but not for you? There's hypocrisy embedded in so much of the testimony. It's not that the testimony itself is wrong, yay, freedom, but what does it mean to actually say, let's all be free? What does it mean to empower each other? So what furthers life and gives hope is whatever heals broken relationships and liberates life that has been oppressed. What if the church in the United States for the last 200 years was known for healing broken relationships and liberating life that had been oppressed? Now, there are glimpses of this. And when you study history in its complexity, you see that this isn't me talking idealistically and saying, well, don't listen, the Christianity, I know all the truth now and the Christianity before, forget about that. This is actually a critique that's happened throughout church history when the church gets co-opted by the powers, because money has power. And if you start defining church according to a big church building or a lot of resources or sound system or whatever, then you're drawn to the people that can help you get those things. And then you're willing to hold loosely things that they value that might be wrong, but you don't want to offend them because you want these, and you think these, well, we'll let that go because they'll help fund these better things. And what I'm saying here is the better things are these things. The better things are the love we have for each other, the liberation, the hope we have for each other, to empower each other. What if, you go down the list, and I have so many different stories of these crossroads in church history where the church could have gone one direction but went the other direction. Well, what do we do with that? Do we say, let's give up on Christianity? No, this is my argument, my journey, my task, and I do this professionally, is to say, okay, we're going to have new crossroads in front of us. How do we make the decision that leads us further into the empowering life of the Spirit? Because it is only that way that we're going to have the fullness of the church. A church that breaks relationships and oppresses life is not the church of Jesus. Learn from our past and do better. That's exactly it. Learn from the mistakes we made. I love seeing history as really like our cultural memory. Just like in our own memory, you look back and it's like, for those of you who are like in their mid 40s, like me, you can look back and say, man, what did I do that thing 20 years ago, and why is that thing stuck in my head? It keeps reminding me. Well, our memories shape us, and those good victory moments of saying, yeah, I did good, gives us this empowering, but also those mistakes are like, that's still a part of me too. And I know there's a danger there. I know I'm liable to mistake, but I know now that by listening to people back then, I went a direction I shouldn't have gone, and I should have gone this way. Well, how can I be someone who speaks that into the life now? So to history. When you study Civil War, I was really into Civil War history, and it's a really complex era precisely because there's so many mixed messages from all sorts of different directions, and it's so much easier just to make this binary of good people, bad people. And that's not how life is. There are abolitionists who were racist, but there are also abolitionists who were genuinely passionate about God's vision for an equal humanity. And there's all of these different stories going on. And we can learn and listen to this. Yes, love Civil War. It's my favorite movie. I did this in a blog post the other 1989, I was super into Civil War history, and the movie Glory came out. And that movie was like a coming together of so many different themes. It's been my favorite movie ever since. I think I've seen better movies that may be more artistically done, but Glory is like, if you want to understand Patrick Odin's development from the time he was in late high school onward, Glory, Civil War history. I want to get back to that. I don't live around Civil War history. I'm here on the West Coast in California, and so I don't get a chance to go to all those places. I would probably be one of the reenactors, and I think part of my distancing from Civil War history is just the actual physical distance from Civil War history. So, as I said, I was actually watching the history of Sacramento, Black history of Sacramento, the experience of African Americans in Sacramento, before we were starting here, and like that's my little bit of taste. Sacramento has a little bit more history. So, what does it mean to say, yes, Denzel, yes, Morgan Freeman, so good. What furthers life is whatever heals broken relationships and liberates life that has been oppressed. And that really movie hits that. Speaking of Glory, because it's all about the 54th Massachusetts, who goes, the first black regiment, the federal government, not the first black regiment, because they were liberated slaves who were put in these kind of like work units. It didn't count. This was actually a fully on fighting regiment who had this wonderful history. And so we talk about them fighting against the oppressors and being given the rifles and going into battle. And it's this empowering story. But all throughout, too, are these stories of broken relationships, because trauma, chaos, tension breaks relationships. And all throughout, you see this formation of a kind of brotherhood and renewal and these different histories and pasts and coming together and healing of history. It really comes together so that they're willing to sacrifice for each other. And that, to me, hits home of what does it mean to heal broken relationships. It means first taking that step ourselves. We have to be people who heal our own broken relationships as much as possible. Other people may not want to heal, right? But there's a brokenness inside us that can cause chaos. And we also want to be people who, rather than take our brokenness and say, well, I'm going to dominate others and they're going to get a piece of what I experienced, we say, I'm going to trust the power of the Spirit and the new life and say, how can I help people, whatever their situation, be free? And then whether that's in a kind of place of hurt where they're oppressed, or my recent book, Hope for the Oppressor, says people who are oppressing are slaves themselves because they're caught in a kind of lifestyle where they're destructive to others, but also to themselves. And they may have a lot of stuff, and they may have a lot of power, but their destiny is death. And as much as they're indulging death, and as much as they're indulging oppressing others, they're distancing themselves from God. They need freedom. That's not freedom. Stuff isn't freedom. Stuff is nice, right? If you're not going to be free, better to do it with a lot more stuff than without a lot more stuff, right? But better to be free and whole and in communion with others. So the cross confronts oppression and defines the mission of God. If you want to know what I mean about this, we talked about the cross a couple of months ago. You could look in my YouTube channel or in earlier videos. The cross confronts oppression because it's saying that Jesus, who is God, rather than inflicting oppressing on everybody, rather than taking control, showing power through dominance like the Roman Empire did, Jesus says, bring it on. I'm going to offer peace. And the world says, we don't want those people to have peace. And Jesus says, I want the world to have peace. And the world says, you're going to feel what we can do. And Jesus says, bring it on. Oppress me. And in that, he takes the weight of the oppressing. He takes the burden. He takes the wave, crashes over him, destroys him, kills him, dehumanizes him. And that's the experience of the oppressed and the broken, whether broken in spirit or broken in society. That's the experience that they have with this world. And what Jesus says to that is, do this to me, but you're not going to win. Because the message of the cross continues in the message of the resurrection. Bring it on, Jesus says. And those who are willing to stand with me, stand behind me, I'm going to lead you into a new path. But the world doesn't have power anymore. And that's the expression of the early church. Rome said, you need to betray Jesus. You need to forsake Jesus. You need to give up your faith. You need to give up your faith either in testimony or, what are you doing not doing all this stuff that we think is good? What are you wasting your time for? Get distracted. Distraction's fun. And these Christians said, no. We want the way of life. And you can't tell us what it means to be free because you don't know yourself. So what is the mission of God? The mission of God confronts oppression so that it invites people into a new experience of life. So the church then becomes the people who do not use the tools of oppressing to further the mission of God, because God himself, who could have done anything, didn't use those methods. So who do we think we are when we're using the tools of the world to do a mission that God himself didn't go that direction? Do we think we know better than God? The answer is so many people do. So many people think, well, God doesn't know about all these people who are out there who are sinners and doing all this stuff. We need to use the power of the world to get them in line. And God himself said, I'm not going to force people. I'm going to invite them. So the mission of the church then is to confront oppressing, to invite people to liberation so that they can hear the words of life and hope and freedom themselves. So a theology of the cross then, that starts with the theology of the cross, is also one that looks inwards. It looks into me because I have to say I'm not going to oppress others. I am stuck in a lot of really broken directions that I need to correct. And I'm, when I say that, it's like, what's he doing? I'm like, well, probably in the scale of bad to worse, I'm not doing too bad, but there's still things that are like, you could easily drift off to the side. When I was first doing the discussion of the church, I used a video of the Grand Canyon as a backdrop, and you walk down this narrow path, and this narrow path that you can fall off, and oftentimes you can be pretty close but still fall. It doesn't take a long fall to be seriously injured. So the theology of the cross looks inwards. It looks outwards. It says, what is the world around me like? But it also orients theology, how I understand God, vertically. So the cross says, this is who God is. This is what God did. This is what God values. What does that mean for me? What does that mean for society? So we know not only who God is, but also what does God want us to be in our lives. And far too often we take the message of the cross and say, believe this, and then you'll get the ticket to heaven. And if you don't believe this, we're going to, go to war, or we're going to put these restrictions on you. And we lose the whole mission and message. And in doing that, we actually aren't believing in the Jesus who is. That's powerful stuff. That's be critical. So solidarity with those who have been abandoned undermines assumptions of power, control, and honor. If I say my solidarity isn't with the rich and powerful, my goal is to not get invited to the better dinners or to wear the fancier hats or to have the more and more powerful titles, but to say, how is it that I can empower the people who are disempowered? How can I give hope to people who are frustrated? How can I walk alongside and call brother and sister the people that the world says are nothing? Where was Jesus found? But to do that, I have to be willing to let go my own assumptions. And that's challenging because pride sneaks in. I recently got told that my full-time faculty job was cut because of budget and all the rest, even though I'm doing everything good. And so I'm now working in a more of a staff role for the time being, and I'm scheduled to teach classes, but for significantly less money and without the kind of substantive title that people respect. And it's a humbling experience because when you say I've done all things well, I've spent a lot of time studying and training and doing things that people who have all these honors have, and I'm doing it as well as they are, but I'm left out of the outside. It's very easy for me to say, why is God mad at me? Why doesn't God work this out? I deserve more. I should fight for more. But this other side of me says, maybe all this training, maybe all this guidance isn't so that I can get more for myself, but that I can learn more and more what is it to be on the outside. It's hard to communicate and share a narrative and share a community with outsiders if you are the insider, because you don't want them to soil you. You don't want them to see those are the people around you, and but God is open to those people. God is open to me. Right? I say those people like that, the outsiders. This is me. God is open to me, even though I'm really struggling to find the kind of social successes that I think that, this is what it means to make it in this world. And God is still open to me. Is God mad at me? No. God loves me. God loves you. And that means something. It means something more than anything the world can say, because the way of hope and life is with this invitation of God. And sometimes, oftentimes, God isn't found in the halls of power, but God is found among the outsiders. So those who he says, join me, have to go where he is. So we're open to others, because others, these people who were among on the outside of the power, have been told by God that God loves them and God is with them. And one way God can be with them is by having the community of those who serve him with them. So the church is with the outsiders. What if the history of the church was known as being a community who always was drawn by the outside to the outsiders rather than drawn to the halls of power? This is what the early church was known for before time of Constantine, because they had no access. But after the time of Constantine, some people really not Constantine. I don't think he was the problem. I think it was the fact that God did this really amazing thing in finally ending the persecution. But the very leaders of the church saw that as an invitation to now take control, and they got co-opted. And so often we get co-opted by this seduction of power that we don't want. Nobody who is an outsider wants to be an outsider. What do the poor want? To not be poor, right? There's this deep human longing to find substance, and so often, if we get this ticket into this better way, we'll leave our community behind to take it. And Jesus, though, had everything going for him and said, "I'm going to leave the good thing and go to these people," right? He was open to others because his substance, his meaning, his value came only from God. So he could reach out. He's not looking for the popular group or the money to give him meaning or value, because he had his value in God. And if we found our value in God, we wouldn't need the fancy buildings. We wouldn't need the power. We wouldn't need to have control of the government, because we would say, those things are fine, but I'm going to live my life according to God in a community of people who are going to help others find their freedom. Jesus is a brother in brokenness and in exclusion. God knows what it's like to experience brokenness and exclusion. And the crazy thing is that God enters into that. We don't want to, because we're desperate, we're insecure, we're jealous. All these things that we don't want pain. We don't want pain for ourselves, but if someone else is in pain, we're like, I should probably help you, but that means getting involved. I don't want to get that, label put on me or all those repercussions. Where's Jesus? Where is Jesus? His future becomes their future. So he's a brother in brokenness and exclusion. His future becomes their future. And if we're trying to establish ourselves outside of Jesus, all those things that are promised to us aren't going to go anywhere. Now, there's some who say, well, you have to give up everything. I'm someone who says, be fully who God has called you to be in the situation you're in. For some, they're in situations where money is just part of their life. They're in jobs where money is just being made, and that's not bad. But how do you use that money to help free and liberate others? I'm in a job where money is a struggle, right? And so I'm not going to ever get the kind of heavy income that's going to be this like monetary value or help. So, but just because I don't have an excuse then to say, well, I can't help people financially. Well, I can a little bit, but I can do things like find forums and find directions and speak hope into people's life who may be frustrated. I do that with my students. I do that with other people. Those are things you can do. How is it that you can be a partner with Jesus in helping people experience his future? And we're not co-equal with Jesus, but in the power of the Spirit, who we talked about a few weeks ago. In the power of the Spirit, we're empowered to be that very presence in the context and calling that we're in. What does that mean for you? What does that mean for me? What does that mean for us as a community? The cross is this place where we have to stop. We say, if this is the method of God, then this doesn't make sense. And I'm going to then have to say, well, you know what? The methods that I think make sense don't make sense. The things that I think I have to do in order to find value and success with God may be wrong. I have to stop and say, not what does the world say about me, but rather, who am I before this Jesus? The man on the cross is the face of the God upon who our identity is sustained. The man on the cross is the one who is expressing the power of God by subverting the powers of the world, by subverting the idea that the Rome or the empire speaks for the world, that the religious leaders speak for God, that the zealots speak for social progress, because each of those think they're speaking for the world. But if you look at them, and this history is full of this, you peel back the surface and realize the very thing that they are trying to do is actually undermining their goal. Rome tried to bring peace to the world, but through a lot of violence and war, and the whole West continues to resonate that kind of warfare, right? If you look at the history of Europe, you have Roman armies taking over what is now France and Germany and Britain and all the rest, and undermining these historical societies, and in doing that created a kind of context of constant war. Now, it's not truly Rome's fault, because Rome was just really good at it. And then that then gets extroverted, expand into the whole globe. So the very things that were battles of these small little tribes trying to overcome their oppressors back in the 2nd century then become these same people groups asserting their value and identity on peoples in places. But it all comes out of this place of insecurity, causing chaos rather than peace, causing despair rather than hope. The religious leaders who said, this is how you follow God and know you're in or out, rather than saying, inviting people into the presence of the God who is spoken of in the what we call the Old Testament, as Jesus said, actually made things harder. So that people, instead of hearing the message of God and thinking, oh, here's the way of hope, hear the message of God and say, God wouldn't want any part of this. And then, well, if God wouldn't want any part of this, I'm just going to completely give into all this mess because I'm going to hell anyhow. So rather than inviting people into the presence of God, religious leaders turn people away from the very hope that was their only promise. The zealots say, we need to overthrow Rome. We need to put things right, and violence is a way to this. It makes a lot of sense, because if you're caught in systems of power and control, then you think the way to make changes is to take over those power and control. But so often it's not that we're protesting the system, but that we just want the better ranking in the system. And what is the result? Well, the zealots of Jesus' time finally did overthrow Rome, finally did. But then there was chaos. The poor aren't helped. The poor stay the poor, just the people swift power. The promise of having this inviting freedom from this kind of thing, it doesn't work, because once you introduce chaos into the very method, the chaos grows. It's like a cancer, even if you have good goals. So we stop before the cross and say, these things make sense to a certain degree, but can't get us to the result that we are actually longing for. Well, what gets us to the result that we're longing for? What does it mean to be obedient to God? That's right, as said in the Twitch comments, our only ambition should be to obey God. Yes. But even that phrase, and this is the horrible thing about so much of even the current discussion, is so many of the phrases, the being obedient and letting go, these were distorted by false teachers. And this is the way that the enemy works, taking the very truth that gives us hope and distorting it by applying it in the wrong way. Our ambition should be to obey God, but what does it mean to obey God? If we take the wrong commandments and apply them in the wrong setting, we end up actually rebelling against God. The Pharisees who were crucifying Jesus thought they were obeying God, but they were obeying a distorted understanding of what God wants rather than the heart of what God was actually teaching. And that was Jesus' very critique. What does it mean to obey God in fullness in light of the resurrection, in light of the revelation of Jesus? Well, that brings us back to the way of life and hope that is counterintuitive. The cross confronts false or temporary forms of peace by refusing to accept it as true peace. It says, this may make this group of people comfortable, but there's chaos. We can't stop here. We can't just wait until I get peace or I get value, and then the rest of you, I actually have to say, well, if I get blessings from God, I have to be the kind of person who uses those blessings to bring more people in. A theology of the cross, then, can never be a private faith. Christianity is not a private faith. The idea that our religion is somehow private is a nice philosophy, but it actually doesn't. It's impossible humanly, because we're not as segmented as we think we are. What we believe about reality, what we believe about what it means to be human, what we believe about the broader world is reflected in everything we do. And so to say that we need to keep our religious selves private is actually a false premise. And Christianity itself can never do that, because Jesus was crucified publicly. He was resurrected with many witnesses. The whole message of the church is one that reaches outside the bounds of a narrow church or sacred moment, because in saying that God is the creator of all things and is seeking to redeem all things, that means everything is open to now the discussion of what God is wanting us to be. And that has public and political implications. Now, we can disagree on what those are as well. We many do, because we have different ideas and values, and we're all wrestling with what it means to serve God. But we have to also say that we should be oriented in something. And that orientation is that the cross is God's method, not the method of power, not the method of asserting control on others, but definitive and confronting. It's a choice. It's a choice. The cross is not something for me to say, you need to bear your cross. You need to humble yourself. And isn't that the message that justified oppressing throughout so many centuries, as the church would come in and say to the poor, well, we know you're poor and oppressed, but you're blessed, so stay with it. It's like saying to a starving person, God bless you for your wonderful fasting. No, fasting is not done through starving. If you're starving, it's not a choice. You need to feed them. Fasting is a choice. It's being willing to let go of something. The cross is always, it's not for me to say, you need to take up your cross. It's for me to say, how can I join in with the work of Jesus? Now that may have implications for you, but that's for you and God to work out. Good timing, right? Sometimes fasting can feel like starving, right? But it's in the actual choice of the thing where you're actually consciously letting go things that your body wants for the sake of a higher goal, whether that's focus, whether that's health, whether that's all, there's so many different things. But in the choice, it actually creates an ownership over the loss. Rather than oppressing, you're taking ownership, choosing to let things go as a way of saying there's a better something out there. And that's what the cross always is. Church history is filled with people who said, I'm impatient, I don't trust you, I'm going to be the judge. And again, I'm a witness. So I say, the cross is a choice. There's a way to this that leads to hope. Don't believe me, don't believe me. But I invite you to it. But what I can't do, even if I had the power to, is say that you have to do this. Because that then introduces oppressing into the message of the cross, which is precisely the very message the cross was protesting. The church has used the cross as a tool to oppose the very mission of God. Write that down. That's good stuff. Share the video with others. What are ways we can walk through this? What are ways that we can further life by healing broken relationships and liberating life that is been oppressed as particular people and as a community? Well, one is we welcome the stranger. Rather than being distrustful of the stranger, we say, welcome. We don't know you, but God knows you. We might not even like you, but God loves you. So that puts the burden on me to understand what is it that God sees in you. Maybe there's a brokenness because of past experiences. Maybe there's a hurt. Maybe there's just a sense of always being on the outside. Well, welcome. And not just come in and join our community so we can put you in the nice same robes and, then you can, look like everyone else. When you say welcome, what does it mean to welcome? It means to actually say, look at someone in the eyes and say, you are a person that God has made. There's something about you that God is doing. I want to get to know you. I value you. Welcome the actual person, not the number. Churches are so based on numbers, but they're not actually welcoming places. When you welcome someone, you say, you're in. And part of that too is inviting the outsider, the people who aren't just strangers to you or me, but people who are actually on the outside of social structures or on the outside of what some policy. What does it mean to welcome the outsider to those of us who are in particular communities? Is saying someone, they may not be comfortable coming to our community, not because we wouldn't be welcoming, but because they have a sense of not being welcome. They don't know how to journey in. So how can we be people who don't just welcome, but we invite? How do you invite someone? You don't just post a message. You actually go out and you talk to them. You go out among the outsiders. You go to the outside and you say, join us. We're doing something here. There's a way of hope and there's a way of life. Whew, I got through one point in all this time. We'll do a little bit of this. The way of hope, life, and hope. What furthers life is whatever leads to the new beginning of life and hope. What is hope? Where can hope be found? Not just in an eternal sense, though it includes this. What is hope for our life now? I have hope that I can finally have a job that lasts permanently and that I can have a sense of rest, that I'm going to have a career that actually all the things I do is invested in some kind of growth, rather than spending the last 5 years doing a lot and now reverting to a part-time kind of status. Well, where did all that work go? If my hope was in the academia, I'd be very discouraged right now. And I'll be honest, I flirt with that discouragement and despair. But my hope isn't in academia. My hope is in Christ. No matter what happens, all the things I've done, all the things I've learned is actually feeding into my calling, my mission, which may or may not be paid more or less. But my mission, the things I've learned, communicating here, is something that God can use. I could work wherever, in the most menial job, and still have a sense of God's calling and making all this stuff make hope. So that's my goal. So we're done. Yeah, I'm glad I didn't stay discouraged too. It gets me up, it gets me going, it gets me back on track, and God is doing something. Eschatology isn't just end times, it's this way of hope and the way of promise. God is doing something in my life. And sometimes I feel that in my heart, and sometimes I have to tell myself that and hold on to it intentionally so that I keep walking. And that's my message to you all. God is doing something. You don't know what? Ask him. Pray. Whether you're a Christian who's feeling discouraged about the church, pray. What kind of community does God have you in? If you're on the outside of the church, pray. It may feel weird and uncomfortable, but I invite you into this journey because I think you're going to experience something. So thank you for joining me. We'll continue this discussion, the way of life and hope, next week as a way of leading into further discussions and as a way of reminding myself, reminding you, inviting others around. So, blessings upon you. Find peace and be people who bring peace to others and hope to others this week.